So my name's Ben Wieder. As Andy said, I'm a data reporter on the investigations team at McClatchy D.C. Covered policy back in the day with Dan Bach here in the front row. I'm going to talk less specifically about specific types of policy stories and more just about sort of some tips for finding data, some tips for using data, and some tips for kind of vetting data. So both a little bit on how to find things, but also a little bit about like how to think about it. Because I think the thing about data in general is it's one part skill, but it's also one part mindset. And it's not just about, there are technical skills you need to have to work with certain types of data for sure. I'm not going to pretend that you don't need any technical skill to work with data, but it's also about thinking about data. It's about thinking about data in the course of your reporting, thinking about bringing that into your reporting process. So all of you cover, or some of you cover different agencies, and every agency basically has some sort of data that they keep in some way or another. And where they put that data may differ. How they make that data accessible may differ. And I'm gonna cover a few different data sets that are sort of some commonly used data sets from different agencies, but can't possibly cover all the different data sets that every agency has. One place to look beyond an actual specific data page, because some agencies will have a page, have a little link somewhere on their site saying data, click there. And they have data sets available, or as we'll see, agencies are increasingly, I think, developing tools to make their data more accessible, which in some cases may actually draw on multiple data sets. And we'll look at a couple of those. But also a lot of times, the sort of FOIA reading rooms, which may or may not be called a FOIA reading room, it's kind of a throwback to back in the day. If you wanted to look at records, in a lot of cases, you had to actually go to a physical reading room in different agencies to look at records. Now, a lot of the information is online. And a lot of times what will happen is if some data sets are just on a website and easy for anyone to find, and some data sets you actually have to file a public records request to get. And a lot of times when someone has filed that public records request to access a specific data set, they will then put that data set on that FOIA webpage. So it's not where you would normally think immediately to look. Because again, like I said, it's not necessarily on the page that says data, but it's helpful. And in general, I mean, setting aside data, FOIA reading rooms can often be useful for just seeing what other people have requested, what other information is out there that people have thought to look at. Because the reality is, a lot of advocacy groups, a lot of other reporters may have requested information that you're looking for in the past, or in looking at that, it may trigger an idea in your head of information you can request that you haven't thought about. If you are going to go the route of filing a request yourself, a lot of times it can be really helpful to try to see if you can get like the form that would be required to be filled out to create the data in the first place. So, I mean, if we take a step back, there's sometimes a sense that data sort of exists kind of up in the clouds on high, but in reality, I mean, data exists because people put it into a computer. Oftentimes when you're trying to think about what data, when you're trying to think about, asking for a specific type of data, it can be helpful to find the forms that that people have to fill out when they're submitting the data. If someone was filling out forms about, like lobbying information, if you look at the form that a lobbyist has to fill out, well, that gives you a pretty good idea of what's going to be in that data set. And the same can be said for any sort of data, whether it's like environmental data, you have to fill out this data if you're, you operate a plant or something like that. That gives you a sort of a roadmap to the kind of information that you would expect to be able to find at this agency. And then worst comes to worst, you can always build your own data set. I mean, Sarah obviously talked about crowdsourcing data sets. That's, one way you can go. You can also kind of build a data set through looking at a mix of records and crowdsourcing and news reports. A good example of that was a few years ago, the Washington Post built their own data set of like police-involved shootings because they felt like there wasn't a definitive data set that existed on that. And so they did a combination of things where they looked at news reports, they looked at some groups that were tracking it, they looked at some existing crime data, and they kind of pulled it all together and built a data set that really didn't exist in its own right before that. And one of the examples I'm going to show you is in a minute of types of data that are out there is some of the data on crime that exists. But with the caveat in that case that the Post, for example, had found that data didn't answer the questions they had about police-involved shootings. So I'm going to walk through a couple kind of common data sets and agencies. And I should say, at any point, feel free to stop me if you have a question. If there's something you want to ask about, if there's something you want to talk about, a data set you've worked with that you think other people in the room would really like to know about, don't hesitate, don't be shy. Just as before, I would say, hold off if you can on asking the question until you have the microphone. Oftentimes, the whole sort of mission here today is thinking about policy as it affects people. And so when you want to understand people, the Census Bureau is a good place to understand, where people are and the demographics of different people and all sorts of things that you can think about. And we think about the census as, every 10 years they go around and they ask people all sorts of questions. But the Census Bureau obviously puts out all sorts of data. And they put out some data that is much more regularly updated than every 10 years. And many of you have probably worked with the variety of products that the census puts out, whether it be, the census itself or the American Community Survey, other things like that. There's a lot of different things out there. The Census Bureau, as you can imagine, has a lot of data. And they actually have a new site they're just in the process of rolling out at data.census.gov. If you have a laptop and you want to, you can feel free to go there and check it out. And it's kind of interesting. They used to have a thing called American Fact Finder, which was kind of a little less user-friendly. The thing that is nice in a way about data.census.gov is I think it's built with more of an audience of someone who's not necessarily a data person in mind. And so there's a few different ways you can search. So you can search by topic. So you're interested in a type of policy, you're interested in a type of issue. So this is an example. If you type in poverty, what you're gonna see when you type that in is all the types of information that's available related to that topic. So, if you're covering a policy issue and you want to have an understanding of the population you're looking at, this is a quick way to kind of find that information. Because at the end of the day, when we think about using data for a story, we can use it for a few different reasons. We can use it to sort of quantify how much certain things are happening and say, this is where it's the worst, this phenomenon has increased or decreased. It can also actually be a useful sourcing tool in a way. Because if we want to think about who is most likely affected by a policy, it sort of helps to have an understanding of what communities, what populations are affected by that policy. So for example, if we were writing about poverty, we could find places that are experiencing this. We could find areas that we might want to reach out to try to find people who might be affected by an issue. And that was one example. I mean, you could think of any topic to put in there. But it can really help you find both who potential sources, communities to look to find information, and then also who your audience is. Because, you have a sense of these are communities that are going to be affected by this policy. These are people whose lives are going to be affected by this policy. These are people I want to make sure I'm hitting. These are people I want to make sure are seeing, the work that I'm putting out. So it's sort of that dual-edged sword of both a source but also an audience as well. And I think that, understanding where people are is a way of getting at that idea. Before I go on, any questions about any of this so far? And it's okay if there aren't. This is just another way of accessing census data. If you have a more specific idea of what you're looking for, than a specific topic, you can do an advanced search and you can you can filter. This looks more like what American Fact Finder used to look like, and that's once you're sort of a Census Pro, and you know the specific types of data you're looking for, you can use the advanced search, and it's good for that as well. One of the things that I think is really cool that the Census Bureau, and in fact, it's produced by the Census, but it involves Bureau of Labor Statistics, which we'll talk about in a second as well, is they kind of pre-cut the data in some ways that make it a little bit more, I think, accessible. And they do this thing where it's called My Congressional District. And the first time I found this, what I liked about it was it made a lot of this data very easily digestible, but it also gave me ideas of like how I could start to think about different communities. And if you have a laptop, I would say try to pull up this site. It's I thought the link was the address is here. It's I think it's census.gov/mycd, my congressional district. And the nice thing about this is it gives you an idea of what's available. Because a lot of times with data, we have an idea of I would like maybe a certain type of data. A, where do I go to find it? I don't know. B, I'm interested in this general topic. Is there even data on this? One of the things that's nice about looking at it from this perspective, through the lens of a congressional district, is they sort of have a variety of different ways you can look at this data, and it shows you what's even there. So for example, you can see the types of jobs in a particular congressional district, the demographics of a particular congressional district. And I think when we think about policy and we think about how policy affects people, I think it's useful to think about this. If we're thinking about the people who are crafting these policies, if we're thinking about politicians crafting these policies, it's useful to know, well, who do they represent? Does this affect their community? Are they pushing for a specific type of legislation because it affects their community? And maybe it doesn't, but I think it's important to sort of keep that in mind. And again, when we're thinking about this sourcing thing, if you're writing about tariffs and they're going to affect a particular, they're going to affect farmers, they're going to affect manufacturers. This is a quick way to find places where there are a lot of those people, or maybe where there are none of those people. It's kind of useful to kind of give that slice, because I think with data, one of the challenges can be when you're exploring it, especially when you're just getting started looking at data, is it can be sort of overwhelming. There's so much out there. There's such a huge universe, and so I think part of why I like to point to this site is that it gives you a sense of, here's a few different things you might want to look at that you might not have even known you could look for, or that you might not have known how to find. So yeah, I would say, if you've gone to this site, poke around a little bit, see if there's anything interesting there, anything surprising. If you want, you can download the data from here, and you can, when we a little later play around with data a little bit, or I'm going to sort of show you how you manipulate data. You can try to do that on this. You certainly don't have to, but you can if you want. You'll also sort of see, if you do download this, that one of the downsides of working with data, particularly from the census, is that it doesn't always come in a format we particularly would prefer it to be in. So if you do wind up doing that and you have questions, I'm happy to talk about it. So anyway, this is my congressional district. And like I said, it is drawn from data from both Census and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so this gives you both demographics, and it gives you kind of like, employment and types of employment and that sort of thing. And again, like I said, it's kind of a nice lens for thinking about specific places. Because I think, when you think about, manufacturing, in the abstract, what does that mean? When you're thinking about a specific community, which is what a congressional district is, I mean, these are not huge, huge areas, I think it makes it a little bit more real. So Bureau of Labor Statistics, great resource for all sorts of labor statistics, all sorts of employment statistics. Again, you're trying to figure out, who's affected by this policy change? Who's the audience for this policy change? You can look at this by communities and sort of determine, who has these types of jobs, who's lost these types of jobs. I mean, you can also look at this over time and see, what are the communities that have gained jobs? What are the communities that have lost jobs? Who's winning and who's losing in the economy? And I'm not saying that you should write the story who's winning and who's losing in the economy, but it tells you like who these policies are real for. And it helps you potentially identify, communities that you should be targeting, reaching out to people in, to get a sense of what the real world impact of a particular policy is, and find people who for whom this is not, an abstract number, but is, their day-to-day life. And what I'll say about both the Bureau of Labor and the Census Bureau, the people who work there are incredibly helpful, very responsive. I can't tell you the number of times I go to the Census Bureau or I go to BLS and I'm looking at data and I spend like 10 minutes, either sometimes I just get it immediately, but if I don't get it, I'm like trying to figure out what's there, start Googling a little bit, and then I say, you know what, I'm just gonna pick up the phone. And these people are very happy to work with you. They don't get a lot of phone calls. They're really happy to explain the work that they do, and point you in the right direction. I mean, routinely I call them and I think that I want one type of data. Turns out actually what I want is something else. So I really recommend, with these agencies in particular and in general with data, to not hesitate to pick up the phone and call people. Yes, exactly. Yeah, please do. No, I mean, seriously, it's great. And what I'll say is also, like, some agencies, if you're a reporter, there'll be a tendency to say, some people will have a sort of fear of talking to reporters and will try to kick you to comms people. You want to talk to data people if you're working with data. And sometimes you have to convince a comms person that you want to talk to data people. Because at the end of the day, like, you want the right information. You want someone who's going to help you understand that information. And it's mutually beneficial. The data people who spend their lives building this data, they want that data to be reported accurately. They want that data to be spread to the world accurately. And I don't find that to be too difficult of an issue. But again, I think, always push, if you're working with data, always push to talk with the data people, because they get it, they understand it, and they want to help you. They want to help you use data accurately. Talk about a couple other data sets. And like I said, I'm not going to bog you down with like a million of them, because people in the room are interested in different things, and I don't want to spend 20 minutes on one subject that you might not care about at all. And if there are any questions, again, I would say, please don't hesitate. Public health data, the CDC has a tool called Wonder, which has all sorts of great data on all sorts of different things. One of the most common uses of the data from Wonder is, over the last few years, if you've seen stories about the opioid crisis, there are always these stories, always these maps that you see about where the opioid crisis is hardest hit, which communities are most affected by the opioid crisis. Well, that data comes from Wonder. They produce, they have like a whole database of like basically how people died. It's a very cheery database. And that's where overdose death data comes from. And they adjust it by population. And that's something I want to talk about for a second, which is, if we look at raw numbers, so for example, if we were looking at raw numbers of opioid overdose deaths, if we look at raw numbers, just how many happened last year, we could be writing a story about like New York, California, or Texas every time. Because typically the biggest places are where the most things happen. It might not be the case with everything, but in this case, Wonder provides, they create a rate, and I'll talk a little bit about like rates and ratios and what that means. They create a rate of how frequently, in this case, there have been overdose deaths per 100,000 people. And the reason why that's important is because it sort of creates an apples to apples comparison. If we're looking at just different states and we look at how many times something happened just in raw numbers, comparing Delaware to California doesn't make any sense. What you really need to do is control for population to find out where something is the most acute. West Virginia might have a lot fewer people than a bigger state, but if in this case 45 out of every 100,000 people are adults are dying from overdose deaths, well, that tells you that's a really big deal. And it's not, when you look at the death number, Pennsylvania, which is fourth on that list, has far more deaths. but it's also a far bigger state. So just reporting on raw numbers, you're not really getting the story with this type of data and with all types of data. It's something to keep in mind. If you're writing about, if you're trying to find a community, if you're trying to find a place that is most affected by a policy, you really want to be adjusting by the population of that place to really find where something is really an issue. Because it might be that there's 10,000 people who are affected by a certain issue in New York, but it's actually not that common because the population is so big. But if 10,000 people are affected by that issue in West Virginia, well, that's a really big deal. And probably everyone knows someone in the state who's affected by that issue. So it's just something to keep in mind. And again, this is not a specific tool or a specific thing. It's more of a mindset of thinking in terms of, the importance of trying to sort of put things in sort of an apples to apples context where you're making accurate, fair comparisons.
Where did you find that?
This information. So if we go back to Wonder, so they have, if you go, this is a screenshot, obviously. At the bottom, they have this mortality underlying cause of death. And once you click on that, you can kind of click through and ultimately, the code here, there's a specific code that's like overdose deaths. You can search within Wonder, you can search for type cause of death. And I think in this case, it's overdose deaths. I don't remember the exact term, but you search for overdose deaths and then you can then choose to look at it by state, and then it will produce ultimately this table, which is a table of overdose deaths by state.
Can you go further detail?
Yeah. Does anyone want to? Beyond state, like county?
Yeah.
For that kind of information, generally speaking, at least for health data, not necessarily for other types of data, generally speaking, you're probably gonna have to go to a state agency. But there are, I don't remember off the top of my head if Wonder goes beyond that level of detail for this. They have other geographies though. And I don't remember whether overdose deaths goes beyond state, but I know for a lot of other types of things, they actually do break it down into smaller geographies. So like zip codes, census tracts, which is like a sort of like a neighborhood. Lots of geographies beyond that. And going back to the census, one of the terms that you'll see when you start looking at census data is geographies, which like you kind of intuitively understand, but like you don't really, like geographies is not a word we use. Geographies just means like type of place. So, a state is a geography, a country is a geography, a neighborhood is a geography, a zip code is a geography. And oftentimes you can get data at different levels, but and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. Part of the reason why sometimes they don't make data available at smaller levels, it kind of comes down to how the data was collected. When we think about, when I talked about the Census Bureau before, the census, which happens this year and happens every 10 years, is they literally try to go door to door or get information from every single person. And so they can report that to a pretty granular level and feel confident about the results. I can report the results of a neighborhood and feel pretty good about it. But a lot of other things that they produce are surveys. And, we've all seen surveys before, but essentially what a survey is, you're looking at a portion of the population and, saying that portion's responses represent, the larger universe. And for smaller groups, when you do a survey, it's not necessarily like statistically valid to look at a smaller geography. So if this is based on a survey, it may not be legitimate, like it may not be statistically sound to reduce this to the level of a neighborhood, because maybe only one person in that neighborhood responded to the survey. And so, they're not really an accurate stand-in for their whole neighborhood. So yeah, I mean, we'll talk about that more in a second, but how data is collected, where it comes from, kind of influences how you can use it.
Ben, Dan Vach, you know me, but the one question I have that I get frustrated with BLS and census, as you mentioned, is that they usually do 1 year at a time. So like, you talked about how manufacturing jobs change over time. Do you have any, are there like shortcuts or ways that, to compile 10 Excel spreadsheets onto like, to see that easier, what the change over time is, which is usually a better story than just a snapshot if you don't have a reference point.
Yeah, I mean, so in some cases, and I think as we see more agencies moving to like the sort of tool model, and when I say tool, I mean like building kind of like a database where you can kind of pick specific options and kind of choose how you want to see it. I think we're seeing more of an instance where you can select multiple years. I've done it both ways, where in some cases I've been able to get one spreadsheet that has multiple years, and then I can kind of like line them up and do a comparison of 1 year to the current year or something like that. I've also unfortunately had to do it the other way, where I download like 10 spreadsheets and then combine them into one. It's agency by agency, and I think, like I said, places are moving in the direction of making it easier to get all that data in one spreadsheet. But sometimes, unfortunately, you just have to download 10 of them and combine them.
I'm curious, in that sort of situation where you're just trying to figure out whether to look just at the tool or like a graph that has the numbers or whatever, or go into like the actual Excel spreadsheet or whatever the tabulation spreadsheet is. Do you ever err on the side of just going into the spreadsheet, even if there is a tool, just to ensure that the data is accurate? Not that they're maliciously misreporting it, but just you see any of those inaccuracies and whatnot.
I think you get sometimes a greater level of detail, and sometimes like this is not really a policy thing, but like I'll give one example is like for USA spending, which is government contracts, the information that's available on the screen is far less detailed than the information that's available when you download the data. So sometimes, even though you've seen the data on the screen, you may not realize that when you download it, there's a whole lot of other stuff there that may actually be really relevant to what you're looking at. So I would say, especially if you do feel comfortable with spreadsheets or you're working with data in other ways, it's always worth downloading the data. And going back to the example to what I was saying before about talking to agencies, that's also a great example of a time when it might make sense to pick up the phone and call someone. Because if you say, hey, I'm trying to look at how this changed over 10 years, I can pull it together from like 20 different places, but is there anything you can do to help me? One, the person on the phone may be able to say, this is the button you have to click to get that information. Or they might be, and you'd be surprised how often this happens, they might be willing to say, listen, give me 10 minutes, I'll send it over to you. It happens. It's happened to me for sure, where I ask for a certain type of information and they're happy to send it to me in a more user-friendly format. It doesn't always work that way, but it's always worth asking the question for that reason. And I also say, in general, to your point again, yeah, I would always recommend, if you feel comfortable looking at the data and working with the data, it's always worth downloading a spreadsheet because there might be something else interesting that you're not seeing on the screen. And I don't know that it's malicious, but it's just the reality is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. I mean, there's no way that any agency is going to be able to anticipate every possible question that people are going to try to answer with their data. And so they're making their best guess when they put up this information on the website of what they think is the most interesting. But it may not be the most interesting to you. If you're writing about a specific thing, that might not be relevant to what you're trying to find. You may be trying to find one aspect of this that's not the most common aspect. So getting to other data sets, USDA has quick stats on types of crops. This is great when you think about tariffs and some of the stuff we're thinking about. And again, not to write the story of, there are X number of acres of corn in the country. To write the story of, here's the town that's like getting screwed by tariffs, or here's the town that's like making a ton of money off tariffs and like gonna be in really good shape. Here are the people I can talk to, here are the people whose lives are affected by this. And here's the audience that's out there for this story about how tariffs affect this particular crop. So, again, and if you look here, they have these geographic levels on the screen at the bottom. The geographic levels give you a sense of how you can kind of look at this. And so again, when you're trying to, from a sourcing perspective and from an audience perspective, this kind of helps you find people who are affected by this. I mean, if you're writing, if you happen to be working for, if you're typically covering things for a particular state or locality, you may know that, your state happens to produce a lot of soybeans, but if you're covering things sort of more broadly and you're just trying to find the real examples of where a policy kind of really is going to make a real impact, this can kind of help you find those people. So again, very valuable for this, and we'll talk in a minute about some other USDA data, in reference to some of the stories that we were talking about earlier today. So USDA quick stats, and I'll have links, by the way, to all these sites that I've shown here at the end. I know with the census one, I had the link up there, but the others, they'll be in one slide, all the information on where to find these. And then the last one I want to talk about is this Crime Data Explorer, and this is an example again of like the DOJ ultimately trying to make crime data more accessible. A lot of this comes from uniform crime reports, which local police stations report to the FBI, which are not perfect, as evidenced by what I was talking about with the Washington Post when they tried to write that story about police-involved shootings and found that, the FBI data didn't have what they were looking for. But this is another example of Crime Data Explorer of an agency trying to take data from a few different places that they collect it and make it a little bit more user-friendly so that you can kind of go on there, and even if you're never going to download the data, you can kind of find some information and sort of, cut it in a few different ways. I've talked so far about government data, government agencies, and oftentimes that is, the source for a lot of data that we're interested in on policy. We have a lot of agencies who spend their time collecting information about, what's going on in our country. But a lot of times, we've all gotten the email about, a new data set or a new study or something on a subject. And, the question is this information we should feel comfortable using? And I would say in many cases, yes. And I think, there are a few functions that, non-government data can serve. One, as I was saying before, the end user of government data isn't necessarily, you or me. We're not necessarily the end user of that. A reader is not necessarily the end user of that government data. And sometimes what, whether it be advocacy groups or academics or whoever, they're able to take perhaps government data that exists and make it more easily digestible. And for you, when you're just trying to find a number or trying to find some data to analyze real quickly, that can save you a lot of aggravation and a lot of time. And so I would say absolutely use that information if it's more available. The reality is also, with the way that the government works and much of the work that's being done is being done by contractors, which in many cases are universities and outside folks. So government data, the distinction can sometimes be somewhat arbitrary between government data and non-government data. I will say, there's some basic things you want to know. You want to have a sense of who's giving you this information. You want to have a sense of whether they have a particular angle one way or another. Doesn't mean the data is bad if they do. You just want to be aware of it, and it's something you might want to ask them questions about. You certainly want to ask them what their sourcing was. In many cases, they're probably just taking government data and repackaging it, but it might not be. They might be collecting data themselves. They might be doing their own work. You just want to have a sense of what their data is and also what the limitations are, because you want to have a sense of what can you say with this information, what can you not, what are the limitations. You want to know it yourself, but you also want to be transparent about that when you use it so that your readers understand what you can and can't say. And I will say, and this sort of actually is similar to the idea of downloading the spreadsheet from the government agency itself. If it does come from government data, if there's a couple numbers you can check, go and check it. You can spot check it and make sure that they are being accurate in what they're presenting it. If you know where the original source came from. That again, it's not to say that you shouldn't use it. It's just to say that it's always worth checking. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of this example, use that example, that lens, thinking about the story that you guys were talking about earlier with Andy, thinking about the new school lunch rules and that reducing food waste being one of the goals. So you're thinking about, how do I write a story that is going to get at this question of the new school lunch rules, and one of the goals being reducing food waste. And so your thought is, well, what can I find about that? Like, what kind of information is even out there about food waste? And it turns out earlier this year, the USDA did release a study which measured food waste to some extent. And so this came out in 2019, although government data being what it is, the results are from like 2014 or 2015. It then took them 4 years to put it into a report. That's the way it goes with government data. There's always a lag, and that's fine. So I pulled out a couple interesting tables that were in this report. And these would be kind of interesting to think about if you're writing that story. What this is showing is the actual waste by type of food.
I'm just going to quickly chime in and say, so when we were asking readers earlier, the question of, well, how much food is wasted, and is this the type that's being wasted, the types that are being changed? This is an opportunity to actually be able to answer that question.
Yeah, no, so I mean, this breaks it down like in pretty detailed format of like different types of foods and how often they're being wasted, you know, not consumed, left on the plate at the end of the day. The term for it is plate waste. And they actually I think they actually take pictures of like people's trays at the end to calculate what's left at the end of this. But this gives you a very detailed breakdown of like, you know, all the different types of foods. So, you know, again, when you're thinking about, you know, if the rules are changing the types of vegetables or things like that, you know, here's data that shows, you know, were vegetables being wasted more than other things. So, you know, again, if you're thinking about that real world example of like your kid's school lunch, this is actually getting into like what's on the tray and what your kid's not eating, which I think is valuable for thinking about it. This is again more types of food and how often they're wasted. And then at the bottom, you see like the number of trays they looked at. So there's like 2,000 trays, which is kind of funny. Like you think about someone like some scientist standing at the end of a cafeteria line being, here you go. And then there's some other breakdowns, and this is a breakdown based on like different types of characteristics of the lunch itself. And one of the things that I thought was one of the most interesting things was they looked at like how much food was wasted by when lunchtime was. So like if your kid's hungry, like if your kid's hungrier later in the day, are they more likely to eat all their food? And again, if you're thinking about how this affects your local school as a parent, it's like, well, maybe if we want to reduce waste, maybe we should like make lunch hour an hour later. You know, maybe that's the answer to making sure that kids actually eat their lunch. So I think, you know, I think that there's, you know, this is the kind of thing where there's a lot of interesting facts and numbers you can pull from here. And it's from government data, so we feel pretty good about it. With that said, I saw this data and I saw this report and I said, this is really interesting. But I'd be curious to know, like, are there differences in like different parts of the country or different states or different cities? Well, that's where we get into how the data was collected. This was a survey of like 160 schools. So they can't break it down further than this national level estimate, which is okay, it's fine, but it's something that's good to keep in mind if you're trying to get a sense of like, you know, is Colorado the most wasteful state for school lunches? Like, you're not gonna be able to get that from here. But it's worth the phone call. I mean, I talked to someone from the USDA and they were very helpful in trying to track down this information and dutifully reporting back that it did not exist at that level. And, you know, that then raises questions. Okay, well, what can I say with this information? What can I not? So we can say a lot of really cool things about like what types of foods are being wasted and like how lunchtime affects that and other characteristics. And I think they break it down maybe here or elsewhere. I think they break it down by like elementary school versus high school and things like that. There's a lot of cool things we can say with this data, but we might need other numbers as well. And that's where we might turn to non-government sources, because for whatever reason for the USDA, this was their priority. Other things that we might be curious about were not their priority. So here's a study that came out a few years ago. And the source, it's on a site, PubMed, which is a government site which has medical studies But it was done, I think, by researchers at Harvard, if I'm not mistaken. And they looked at kids at schools in Boston, and they did sort of the same thing where they were taking pictures and figuring out how much they were leaving on their plates. And then they actually figured out an estimate of how much they thought was being wasted. The USDA wasn't necessarily doing that in terms of like dollar figures, but for this study they did. So if we wanted to say, how much food is being wasted, how big of a problem is this, why should I care about this, they have an estimate here. I think their estimate was $1.2 billion, a little higher than that. And so we have that number from them. The World Wildlife Foundation, advocacy group, obviously, they did their own study, and they have their own numbers. And you start to see also, as you go from like government agency to like academic to advocacy group, like the data becomes a little bit more accessible. Like WWF, these are like very colorful, like really nice graphics. This is like information that like intuitively, like it jumps out at you. Whereas like the government report is like a bunch of tables that are buried in like a 1,000-page document that's split up into 5 sections. The mic. I think there's a question over here.
What did you think about what appears to be the coincidence of these parallel studies that are taking place at about the same type of time frames on this particular type of subject matter? Was it because of perhaps a push by the government for more efficiency? Was it just simply coincidence, or what did you think?
I mean, I think that there's obviously been a lot of policy discussion about school lunches. There were, the rules making the school lunches, the nutritional requirements that were put in place by the Obama administration, and then there were the changes that we were talking about earlier today with the current administration in making some changes to that type of food. So I think that when you're seeing these kinds of things pop up, it's because this is an issue people are talking about. And it's interesting because, we might be thinking about this story from the perspective of a parent thinking about, is my kid getting enough food at school? But there's other people who are thinking about food waste as an environmental issue, which is why the World Wildlife Foundation is involved in it. They're thinking about it as pollution and all the methane that comes from extra trash and that sort of thing. So it reflects the fact that there's different lenses that people are taking to look at this issue. And that that it's in people are discussing it, but also I think it reflects the fact that there isn't that much data on this issue. Luckily, this data from USDA from this study came out in 2019, but if you were thinking about this issue 3 or 4 years ago, that data wasn't out there. And so in the vacuum of kind of government data, researchers, advocacy groups kind of stepped in because they said, hey, there's a need for this kind of information. We don't have it. So I think that's what it reflects.
I have on-the-ground experience in a public school in D.C. for 3 years. I could talk to you ad nauseum about this. I even met with the company that has a multi-zillion-dollar food contract with D.C. government. I met with all the city council members, the mayor. It's a lot more complex than the data is going to show.
Sure. No, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of complexity that goes into it. And that's why, first of all, I showed you like 2 or 3 tables from that USDA report. There were like, 200 pages.
But I think you're onto something, and how do you make it now, bring it to the ground?
Yeah.
Because this is an incredible story, and I'm happy to talk to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's true. I mean, this is a story but it's very personal. I mean, getting to the sort of overarching idea of, policy about people. I mean, not much that's more personal than like, what your kid had for lunch. This is very real, I have a 15-month-old daughter, and it's like every month we go into the doctor and it's like, has she gained weight? That's like a big question. So it really matters whether your kids are getting enough food. That's a really important policy issue. And so, it's both very real, but it is also very complex. There's a lot of factors that go into this. And so, our challenge is to sort of cut through that and sort of tell stories that matter to people. And the data can help us with that, but obviously the data is not the story in its own right. But yeah, no, I mean, that on the ground kind of experience is essential. And ideally, what data is going to help you do is connect you with people who have that on the ground experience so that you can tell their stories. I mean, one of the things I always like to think about and say is data's the beginning of the story, not the end of the story. You know, data helps you find it, but you're not done when you've found data and done some analysis. Like, that's when you got to go out and find real people and talk to them and have the data help point you in that direction. So any other questions about either the sources of data or like government versus non-government?
Harvard, I'm a freelancer. And I'm just wondering, the whole lag of data analysis in government, the few times that I've tried to get data that's relevant to a story that I happen to be writing, like right now, job loss due to automation, it's not there yet. So do you have any suggestions on, if you're writing about something very timely and you're looking for good data on backing up what somebody's claiming is happening, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big challenge. I mean, because government data is slow. And I think, you know, with things like job losses and job numbers, there's sort of two things I would say. One, you know, luckily there are, you know, more timely things like, you know, the American Population Survey, ACS, American Community Survey, sorry, and BLS has more regular reports that they put together. So there are some things that are a little more timely. I also think that this is sometimes an instance where it is good potentially to look for like public opinion research that doesn't give you hard numbers in terms of like job losses, but it does give you a sense of like how something is occurring. And similarly, when you're doing a survey, it's similar kinds of questions to what you'd ask for any data source, which is, you know, how did you do this? You know, how, you know, and kind of vetting the quality of the data.
Back to Sarah, because there's another way to go about it, right? If the data is lagging so much that there's none available, you can start to build your own data set by reaching out to actual people. So that's another way to do it, right?
Yeah, I think that's really a valuable thing to mention. And I think, you know, that can be done both by, you know, crowdsourcing in the sense of saying to people, come to us. But, you know, what you were talking about before in terms of like mining things like social media, like just looking, you know, one thing to remember with social media is, you know, not everyone's on social media. A lot of people are not on social media. But, you know, that can help you sort of start to get a little bit of an understanding. And it's helpful sometimes to, you know, this is perhaps maybe a little bit more of an advanced way of thinking about data. It's helpful to think, are there other things that might speak to this phenomenon? And I'll give you an example. So I did a project at McClatchy where I was looking at something called merchant cash advances. They're like sort of like the equivalent of like sort of a payday loan, but for small businesses. And they're unregulated, so no one keeps data on them. So I was trying to say, well, how do I figure out where this is happening and like how often this is happening? And I said, well, unfortunately, some of the people who are taking these out wind up going into bankruptcy. So I looked at bankruptcies where I could find that were connected to, that had these companies listed as like one of the creditors. And the reason I say that is sometimes, you know, you can sort of find the kind of like canary in a coal mine kind of example of, you know, if this phenomenon is occurring, are there ripple effects that I might be able to see that aren't going to say, you know, jobs lost from automation, but might be the other ripple effects of job loss to automation. And so I think that's useful to think about. Like there might be other statistics that help point you in the right direction. This, by the way, is the WWF, the second part. Oh, is there a question?
In the case of looking at bankruptcies for an indication of business health and the subject you were talking about, was that in a specific geographic location? Because it occurs to me that trying to do that on a state or national basis would be like either really wicked programming and coding or just massive. How did you do that?
It was time consuming. I mean, I had a list of like 100-something names of companies that I was searching on. And then I was able to kind of plug them all in and pull down all the bankruptcies associated with those names and then build kind of a spreadsheet. And with that spreadsheet, I was then able to look at geographies and figure out, you know, because my end goal was to figure out where is this problem really prevalent. Nationally, yeah. So in my case, I was able to figure out, for example, and this was very convenient working for McClatchy, which owns the Miami Herald, I was able to figure out that Florida is actually where there were the most bankruptcies associated with these companies that I was looking at. And I had a list of like 100, 150 from like trade publications and other places that were like, these are the biggest players in this industry. And so then I was able to do that. And I did, to take my own advice, I did adjust for population to make sure it wasn't just, Florida's bigger than West Virginia. And Florida, when you adjusted for populations, also had, the most per capita bankruptcies. And so I knew, well, if I want to tell this story well, I really need to find businesses in Florida, because these are the people who are really who are for whatever reason more likely to take out these financial products, and B, are suffering the consequences. These are people who are suffering after they take them. These are the people who are sort of the cautionary tale of why you might want to think twice before you take it.
State bankruptcy courts, where did you search?
So luckily with bankruptcy, it's all at the federal level. So the federal PACER, which is the thing that you search for federal court records, bankruptcy records for everyone is in there. So for bankruptcies, it's really nice. I mean, for other things, it's not as for other types of cases, it's not as easy to find. So a lot of these we sort of talked about already, but this is basically like going through, like asking tough questions of your data. And I think we're kind of running low on time. So I'm going to quickly walk through a couple things we can quickly do in data, but I also, I will post a link to this presentation. I'll send it out via Twitter so that you can look at this.
We're going to share the slides with everybody. After you guys fill out the survey, you'll get a link to all the slides and
Oh,
everything.
perfect. Great. Excellent. Well, then you'll have this handy, and you can also feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about this stuff. But kick the tires on your data. What I mean by that is like, see what's in it. And I'll very quickly show you like a couple things to do. If you've spent a lot of time in Excel, some of this stuff will be second nature, but if you haven't, then these are some quick, easy things to do that if you're using it for the first time are worth knowing how to do. So sorting, which it's making it you can sort things by like greatest to largest or largest to greatest. This just gives you a sense of the universe you're dealing with. You can sort by dates to see like what's the time frame of the data I'm looking at. Does it cover 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? If you're looking at something that would have values, plate waste, the amount wasted on each plate, what was the biggest, what was the smallest. Sorting it gives you a sense of what's in your data and what your universe is, which you need to understand before you know what to say about your data, like what's there. Filtering is a way to narrow your data down. First, you want to start out and see what's there, but then actually you may only be interested in one aspect of your data. It may be that your data looks at a bunch of different types of information. You're only interested in one type of information. So maybe if I was looking at bankruptcy records, maybe I'm only interested in certain types of bankruptcy records, or only by specific states. So I want a filter to do that. There are basic kind of calculations you can do, and percentages and ratios are really big. Percent change is how much has something changed from a starting point to an end point. So when we're thinking about like job losses, raw numbers in and of themselves are fine, but percent change might be a better way to talk about gains or losses or things like that. And then ratios are just how something is, what percentage of the bigger picture something represents. And ratios are kind of related to rates. When I talk about like per capita numbers, that's kind of a ratio. And what that does is sort of make it a little bit more standard, so you can compare numbers, and have sort of an apples to apples comparison. So for states, if you look at it as a ratio of population in that state, well, now you can make a comparison of like, how one thing compares in one state to another state. So that's ratios. And then, summary statistics are things from like old school arithmetic, like the averages and different types of averages. Basic calculations, the simple way to do it is you enter an equal sign and then you fill in whatever formula you're going to do. And unfortunately, this is a little quick, so I'm not going to get through all the different formulas, but you can kind of see here, and all the things I talked about with calculations are things you can do with these basic calculations. One thing I would like to spend 1 minute on, if you haven't used pivot tables before and you like Excel, Pivot tables are great. They allow you to do like all sorts of summary information. They allow you to take your data set and make it, like take a big data set and make it much smaller and easier to work with. The slides will sort of show you kind of visually how to actually create it. But in general, the idea here of a pivot table is to have, to take a big data set and be able to make big conclusions with like a click of a button and not worry about screwing up the data underneath in your spreadsheet. These are different types of programs, which I don't need to get into all of them, but it's helpful to know for familiarity purposes. Obviously Excel, which we just looked at, is a spreadsheet program. Google is like that, but then there's a variety of other types of programs that allow you to work with data in different ways. Database managers allow you to kind of work with multiple data sets and combine them. Statistical programs allow you to do like statistical tests and predict things and see whether something is, how you would, if a certain phenomenon exists more or less than you would expect it to occur. Coding languages allow you to sort of build programs to both to do analysis but get data. Mapping, obviously visual, and then other visualization tools, which are a good way to kind of see in front of you what different phenomena are. Yeah. So a lot of tips here, which I'm just going to put out there because I don't think we have time to go through all of them. But I mean, I think in general, it's important to think about the responsibility you have to readers to be fair and straightforward and transparent. Same thing we do with our reporting and our sourcing, we want to do with our data. And with that.
Super quick question is, on a previous slide you were talking about don't put too much data out there,
yes.
Data fatigue. Is there, a rhyme or reason or the right number?
This is a great way to wrap up because I'm going to take that question and say the right number is, what does your audience need from you?
Well, how do you know that?
Think about who you're writing for, right? And think about the questions they have and whether the information is going to answer it or not, right? So it might need a bunch of numbers. It might need no numbers at all. It really depends on what the story that you're writing for them is trying to achieve for them. And unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you all. I hope that you got a little bit of a 360 view of how to write for the public and also some of the tools and methods that you can use to do that effectively. And I'm going to hand this off to Beth Francesco.
Hi, everybody. We just, from the Institute, want to thank you for taking the time to be here this afternoon, learn more about policy coverage, and of course, thank you to our instructors for sharing their wisdom. I feel a lot more confident about my ability to talk about policy and connect it to readers, and I hope you do too. So with that in mind, when you came in this afternoon, we gave you a card and asked you to kind of outline what your expectation or hope was for this afternoon. I'm going to ask you to flip that card over and answer this question. Because of this program, I can, and then fill in the blank. Let us know what your biggest takeaway was. And while you do that, I want to tell you a bit about programs that we have coming up in the next couple of weeks. On March 17th, we have expert panelists who are going to focus on the impacts to newsrooms and to independent journalists on the wave of frivolous lawsuits filed against the press and some possible anti-SLAPP legislative responses to them. And then the following week, we're going to be exploring, on March 24th, we'll be exploring press freedom issues that occur while reporting in conflict zones. So if you're interested in international reporting, it's going to be a great panel. And finally, before we leave, I want to talk about somebody who's not in the room with us. You may have noticed that some of us are wearing pens that say "Free Austin Tice." Austin is the only American journalist being held abroad. He was detained 2,755 days ago while in Syria while reporting on conflict there for McClatchy and for the Washington Post. The U.S. government believes that Austin is alive and is working to bring him home. Austin's family has been fighting for his freedom for more than 7 years, and we stand with them. We hope that you will too. The National Press Club just announced the second night out for Austin, which will be held on April 29th. Restaurants across the country, and then here in D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, will be committing a portion of their proceeds that night to supplement the FBI's reward for information leading to Austin's safe return. We hope you'll join us. You can learn more about that at nightoutforaustin.com. We thank you for supporting Austin and also for being here for this program this afternoon. Thank you so much.